back of the rim. Garnett on the slam foul. Using Curry way downtown. Oh, what a shot from Curry!
There's this very specific piece of NBA history that nobody ever talks about. The telling of an amazing story that seemed to abruptly end, yet nobody ever questions why it ended the way it did. This shot. It's the last one that Jordan ever took as a member of the Chicago Bulls. It came in 1998, and it was the perfect ending to a storybook run, an ending that literally could not have been written any better. But why was that the end? It was the Bulls' 6th title of the 90s, they'd won 60 plus games 3 years in a row, Jordan was still leading the league in scoring with plenty of good years left, Pippen went on to play 6 years after this, and Jordan returned for 2 more seasons after formally retiring where he was still able to average above 20 points a game. So given those facts, why did the Chicago Bulls go from a three-peat champion in 1998 to a complete rebuilding project with no vital players left except Toni Kukoc in 1999? Jordan's Bulls of the 90s have many layers to them, many stories, many iconic moments, and in a way, a lot of them play a part into the dismantling of their dynasty after the 98 season. But if you have any background knowledge on this situation, then you probably only know the basic story, the one that completely blames Jerry Krause for being egotistic and ruining what they had from the inside out, while also mentioning Jerry Reinsdorf's role in it. That has a lot of truth to it, but it hardly tells the full story. The first part that's important to understand is that Michael Jordan had already gotten tired of basketball long before the final season ever came up, long before his dad died, long before conspiracy theories. Jordan was confiding to teammates that he'd been thinking of hanging it up as early as 1991 after he captured his first title. It sounds similar to what Dirk was experiencing after his first championship, where he wasn't sure what else he had to play for. By 91, Jordan had already been an all-star every single year of his career, won Rookie of the Year, a Defensive Player of the Year award, averaged 33 points, 6 rebounds, 6 assists, and 3 steals over that run, captured 2 MVPs, and an NBA championship. All by the time he was merely 27 years old, meaning he really didn't have a whole lot left to prove to anyone. So although we now know he retired, came back, and played 3 more years, you can see that burnout was already setting in the start of the decade, and it did not stay away forever once he came back. Speaking of that, there's also the part where he told Ron Harper after winning the 96 title that winning 6 championships to have 1 more than Magic Johnson would satisfy him. So the 98 title checked off that box. That wasn't the determining factor though. None of these were really determining, they all just contributed. So on the coaching side, Phil Jackson had what he called his, quote, 7-year theory. Basically, he believed that a coach would only have the attention of a certain group of players for 7 years before they quit listening to him. And if you look at his career, he lived pretty strictly by that rule. With the exception of the Bulls run, which I'll explain in a moment, he coached the Lakers for 5 seasons before taking a break, then another 6 seasons before officially retiring. Now, of course, there were other factors in his Lakers runs, but one of them was the length of time that he gave himself to coach a specific group. So by the time 98 came around, he'd actually done 9 seasons with the Chicago Bulls, but that was because Jordan's random hiatus kind of threw everything off. That gave him the chance to try to capture a title without him, and then when Jordan came back, they had a new set of guys including Dennis Rodman, so he extended himself a bit. But with any background knowledge, you'd also know that he bumped heads quite a bit with Jerry Krause, as did most players in that organization. They disagreed on how valuable a coach actually was, and that led to a lot of back and forth until he gave Jackson his final contract of $6 million. Consequently, during the press release, Krause had made it clear that this was Jackson's final year with the Bulls, quote, even if they go 82-0. That prompted Michael Jordan to solidify his stance during training camp that if Jackson was out next year, then so was he. He made it clear that he wasn't going to play for another coach, and he wasn't going to follow Phil Jackson to a different franchise. None of this was helped by the fact that Jerry Krause had such a huge ego for a general manager, and he was constantly looking for the satisfaction of having built something great. So basically, he felt like he drafted Jordan, built around Jordan, and in essence built the amazing Bulls teams of the 90s. And by the time 98 came around, it was clear to everybody he was ready to mastermind something new. So for that season, MJ, Phil Jackson, and Rodman had all signed 1-year deals. Scottie Pippen's contract was also expiring, so it was pretty clear to everybody that this was likely their last ride together. Speaking of Scottie, before we get to how this team actually functioned on the court that year, you need to understand why it happened the way it did. Scottie Pippen's contract had been a hotly contested subject basically the entire time he was with the Bulls. He was mad in the early 90s that he was potentially getting less money because of Krause's man crush on Toni Kukoc, and in 97, it was floating around that the team actually wanted to trade him because of his contract issues. They were paying Pippen around $3 million a year when he was really worth about 15. And with the payroll already being considerably large, management was looking to keep the number at bay, specifically the owner Jerry Reinsdorf. Pippen caught wind of the trade ideas, and in retaliation, when he was supposed to have surgery right after the 97 season, he pushed it off later into the summer, causing him to miss games at the start of the season, in return forcing Jordan to pick up much of the load. But back to Jerry Reinsdorf, because you can't talk about one Jerry without mentioning the other. On one hand, Krause wasn't shy about flaunting himself as the architect of the Bulls, even saying on Media Day in 1997 that players don't win championship, organizations do. Well, for Reinsdorf, he had actually been willing to go ahead and give him a new foundation by blowing up the Bulls in the summer of 97. He saw the writing on the wall and realized that the Bulls dynasty was on its backside. So his goal was to minimize the time between the Bulls' last championship and the next era of Chicago basketball. In turn, he was actually willing to blow it up starting with the Pippen trade in 97 because, quote, Michael could care less what happens to this team after he's gone. So that helped spawn the idea of trading Pippen. That trade idea pissed Pippen off enough for him to recover on company time, like Shaq would later go on to say. And that leads to the part that nobody ever bothers to mention. The fact that the 98 Bulls were clearly a wounded and vulnerable champion fighting their last battle. But history has kind of buried that part. With all the narratives these days and the efforts to make certain players seem worse or better than they actually were, it's gotten lost that the 98 Bulls probably should not have even been the NBA champion that year. This wasn't some super team, nor was it even comparable to the past dominant Bulls teams. In 98, a 34-year-old Jordan was logging the most minutes on the team at 39 a game to make up for the fact that Scottie Pippen had missed nearly half the season due to injury. And Dennis Rodman was not even starting anymore by the time the NBA Finals came around. In the NBA Finals, Rodman averaged just 4 points and 8 rebounds, Pippen averaged 16 points on 40% shooting, and Jordan had to play 41 minutes a game averaging 34 points to bring that series home. Now, regardless of stats, they did get the job done, but the point with that was, on top of everything else I've mentioned, the 98 Bulls escaped with that last title more than they just dominated to get it, and to make things worse moving forward, they weren't like the 08 Celtics or the 14 Spurs who had important players on the backside of their careers grooming some young star to take over. Actually, we can even compare this situation to the one that screwed the Celtics over when they drafted Len Bias. A big part of their demise was that they were all getting old and injured, and once Bias died before he even got to play a game, they had nobody to relieve the minutes in the rotation for the veterans, nor did they have anyone to pass the keys to as the stars aged out. So just like the Celtics, the Bulls were reaching the end of their line, and their best hope for a young future star was a 29-year-old Toni Kukoc. He did not turn out to be star material once the rest of that team left. So once the Bulls won their final title in 98, the wheels were officially off, and they all knew it. Everybody's general dislike toward general manager Jerry Krause in particular made it kind of difficult to work through any problems they would have had to figure out if they did want to stay together. Just listen to Scottie Pippen openly talking about it in 95 right before Jordan came back.
Your differences with him, are to the point where you can still talk to him, or are you just not communicating at all?
Well, we're not communicating at all. It really shouldn't be a relationship between the general manager and the player. My relationship is pretty much with Phil. I feel like that he's the one that I'm working for. He's the one that's coaching me. So, I can deal with Phil.
Everybody agrees you're underpaid. If your contract was changed, could you be happy in Chicago?
I would have to say no at this point. I think it's at the point now is where I want to go and play somewhere else. I think the franchise and the team has changed since I've been there, and I think it's a time for a change for me.
The truth is that throughout the Bulls dynasty, this team just tolerated Krause. He rubbed Michael Jordan the wrong way from a young age. He constantly pissed Scottie Pippen off about his contract. He and Phil Jackson constantly had problems. And Krause was certain he could be the architect behind a different title squad without any of them. So, with the weight of those personal strains combined with the task at hand of reviving this 98 team for even more title runs, it feels like it really wasn't worth the potential stain of tarnishing their record by going on to lose. And believe it or not, losing is likely what would have happened. While Jordan was still near the top of his game, Pippen was never an all-star again and steadily declined after the 97 season. And as for Dennis Rodman, he barely played in the NBA at all after 1998. It doesn't feel likely that this core was built to continue dominating with what was coming next. For instance, say they do stick around in 1999. If they would have made the NBA Finals, and who knows with the butterfly effect, but it still would have likely earned them a date with the San Antonio Spurs. That team had two dominant big men in David Robinson and Tim Duncan. The Bulls would have had to take that on with a declining core and probably no big men even remotely capable of dealing with the likes of those two. It was one thing to beat Karl Malone or Shaq, but a very different beast when you think about testing their weakest feature with 2 times that strength. And keep in mind that the only team to ever knock Jordan's Bulls out during the 90s did have Shaquille O'Neal on it. And how would Jordan's legacy have been looked at if he went on to play after 98, only to begin coming up short every year either in or before the finals? The writing was simply on the wall. He was satisfied, nobody wanted to deal with Krause any longer, Phil Jackson was moving on either way for personal reasons, and the team had accomplished everything they set out to do through 6 NBA championships. So the results of this were the Bulls going from a 62-win team to 13 wins the very next season. They wouldn't even reach the 30-win mark again until the 2003 season, and even then, the closest they've ever come to glory after this was Derrick Rose. I sense that Bulls fans probably would have liked to have held on to Jordan for every last bit of talent he had left to give, because he clearly could have went on past 98, but for many reasons listed here, it was definitely time for the 90s Bulls to call it a day, or a decade when they did. Even after the 98 championship, the good feelings caused management to assure both Jackson and Jordan that if they did want to return, there were 1-year contracts with each of their names on it. But for the sake of the mystique of their dynasty, let's be thankful they didn't accept. Father Time is undefeated and they simply tapped out before it got a chance to take its final swing.